Chapter 17. The Funeral. The funeral was short and nondescript. There was a lunch following, provided by the ladies of Enchantment, the same ladies Warren had helped out so many times in the past. A long table in the church basement was laden with jello salads and hot dishes, casseroles, of all descriptions. Frosted cakes, plates of cookies, and pans of bars weighed down the far end of the table. Astrid and Jeanette were part of the crew of ladies who had brought the food and were now serving it. Francie had given a half-hearted offer of help, but she was shooed away by women who quickly comprehended that she would only be in the way. So she filled her plate, and since she didn't feel like sitting in the church basement, found her way outside and across the street, where a picnic table offered her fresh air and solitude, plus maybe a little time to think. The day had grown so hot she had little appetite. She ate around the mini marshmallows in the jello and watched people come and go from the church. Heat wavered up from the sidewalk, making the funeral goers appear to undulate slightly. In the thick air, they all seemed a little queasy. Or maybe it was she who was queasy. She eyed her plate with suspicion. She'd purposefully avoided the potato salad and wondered what kind of casserole Aunt Astrid had made. She should have thought to find out. A big taupe SUV peeled into the parking lot, somehow managing to kick up dust, and came to a screeching halt and emptied out Buck, talking on his phone. She strained to hear what he was saying, but could only catch some disconnected words. She thought of sneaking closer, but stopped when he glanced around, unzipped his fly, and aimed into the hydrangeas. Francie almost laughed out loud, but realized that because he had to talk louder to hear himself, she could now hear what he was saying. "Yes, I know." "No, now listen. There's no need for that. Don't—" He paused. "You and I don't see what's the big deal, but believe me, a lot of other people will. It's exactly the kind of thing that gets people all worked up. Yeah, well..." He looked at his phone, crammed it in his pocket, and zipped up his pants. Then he charged into the church while other people began to file out, heading to their cars. Some stopped to chat, some rushed to their cars, and others, not realizing they were being observed, did mildly embarrassing things like picking their teeth or noses. Francie smiled to see a small child spit something out of her mouth into her hand, then tossed the hateful thing into the bushes. Sandy came out of a side door and rushed away. It must be hard for him to get away from the resort. Mrs. Smattering tottered outside carrying something wrapped in a towel. She spoke for a few moments with Mrs. Hanson. Mrs. Smattering peeled the towel away and opened the lid of a casserole dish, and Mrs. Hanson peered inside. They could be two of the three witches in Macbeth, Francie thought, chanting, "When shall we meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain?" Then the ladies went their separate ways, now looking more like ordinary women off to run their errands. Ginger exited the church carrying a stack of papers and some books, which she set in the back seat of her car. Then she leaned against the car and lit up a cigarette. Crazy Ginger, Francie thought. She smoked, drank, and taught Sunday school. When Potter approached from across the lot, Ginger hastily dropped the cigarette and stubbed it out with the heel of her shoe. He really wasn't a bad-looking guy, Francie thought. She wondered how old he was. 10 years older than she was, maybe? Was that too much? Francie told herself to stop thinking about that. He paused to talk to Ginger, and, wait a minute, he was stroking her arm. So it was Potter! Ginger was going out with Potter? Francie stared in amazement as Potter's hand ran up and down Ginger's arm, petting it as if it were a cat. She would have liked to ruminate on that for a while, but then the Fredricksons materialized, looking like a mirage of a family as the heat caused that undulating phenomenon. Mrs. Fredrickson minced across the gravel parking lot in her heels. Francie supposed a funeral was not an appropriate time and place to ask for a favor, but no time like the present, right? She stood up and smoothed the same black dress she'd worn to the party, thanks, Ginger, then crossed the street to talk to Mrs. Fredrickson. Mr. Fredrickson was a bland-faced man who stood slightly aloof, probably accustomed to people wanting to talk to his wife, but not to him. Lettice had perfected a look of being bored and irritated at the same time. "Hi, Mr. Fredrickson," Francie said, and he nodded a practiced, "I know you don't really want to talk to me," kind of nod. "How are you, Lettice?" Francie added, making a quarter-hearted attempt at being friendly. "Darling," Mrs. Fredrickson chirped, then turned to her husband. "This is the Fry girl. She's a big—" Francie jumped in. "No!" she cried, then quickly added, "I'm sorry, this isn't exactly how I planned to talk to you about this, but I'm wondering, Mrs. Fredrickson, well, you see, I know who you are. That is, I recognized you. You're Frederica Ricard. I love your work. Sorry, I sound like an idiot." Lettice rolled her eyes. Mrs. Fredrickson pulled her sunglasses down on her nose and smiled conspiratorially at Francie. "Why, aren't you clever?" she said. I don't want to be rude, but I'm not really a detective," Francie said in a rush. "People seem to think, well, I played a detective on a TV show. A children's TV show," she added under her breath. "Never mind." "So you aren't really investigating suspicious deaths, then?" Mrs. Fredrickson said. "Oh, well, snooping a little, I guess," Francie said. "But it's not what I do for a living. What I really want to do is act. I'm trying to find some work right now, as a matter of fact." "Here? In the North Woods?" Mrs. Fredrickson laughed. "No, in New York. But I just wanted to say—" What did she want to say, she wondered. How could she phrase this? But Mrs. Fredrickson was far ahead of her. "Well, that's simply marvelous, darling. Isn't it, honey?" She turned to her husband, who smiled wanly, clearly weary of exactly these kinds of encounters. Turning back to Francie, Mrs. Fredrickson added brightly, "But, my dear, you really are a detective to figure out who I am. Not that I'm trying to keep it a secret or anything, but believe me, nobody around here has a clue about my stage life. It's quite lovely, you know, to travel incognito. So I'll tell you what, I'll keep your secret if you'll keep mine." She winked at Francie and shoved her sunglasses back up on her nose. "And call me Freddie. All my friends do." She lit a cigarette and went on. "Now, how can I help you?" "I know. Why, this is perfect. A friend of mine is staying with us for a couple of days. He's a casting agent for a—" Francie's stomach fluttered. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Lettice roll her eyes, shift her weight, and cross her arms. "Why don't you stop by? Let's see, tomorrow evening about 9? It'll be just us, since hubby and Lettice are going to the Twin Cities." "Wow! Yes, thanks. Thanks so much. I'll be there." The Fredricksons climbed into their black Lexus and drove away. Francie stood in the dusty lot staring after them. As soon as she was fairly sure they couldn't see her in their rearview mirror, she jumped up and down a couple of dozen times until she couldn't jump anymore. A few stragglers stared at her as they left the church and found their cars. Her aunts and the other ladies were probably starting to clean up by now. Francie knew how to wash dishes. She might as well help. She'd have to wait for her aunts anyway. Francie plucked the damp dress away from her body while she walked to the church. Just as she opened the door, a scream pierced the heavy air, and she bolted down the stairs toward the sound. When her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she gasped. Sprawled on the floor was the pale-skinned, large-bellied, dead-looking body of Buck Thorne. Standing over him, looking as guilty as if she were holding a smoking gun, was Astrid. But it was not a gun she held in her raised hand. It was a spatula.